All right, guys, so today we're going to basically work backwards. We are going to give you a graph and you are going to have to write the equation. So first here, I just have some things for you to think about. This is how I like to approach them. The first thing I'm going to do is draw the midline. The midline is going to give me not only my vertical translation, but it's also going to help me find the amplitude. Then I'm going to make marks that represent where my complete curve starts and where it ends, horizontally speaking. This is going to give me my phase shift and my period. So from doing these two things, I will be able to determine what A, B, C, and D are that I need to substitute into my equation. Okay, so A, we should know, right? Amplitude, the distance from the midline to the max or min. And you also want to think about, okay, where I said my graph starts, is this a reflection? If so, I'll have to plug in a negative as well. Then we're going to find B, which is our parent period divided by our new period. Then we're going to do phase shift and our vertical shift, which these just come from looking at our graph and what we have drawn on there. All right. The other thing when we write our equation is we want to make sure that we either factor out B or we distribute it. I would suggest you factor it out because that's less work for you to have to do. And then last thing, please don't forget your y equals or your f of x equals. It has to be an equation. All right, so let's look at a few examples of what to do here. So here is my first graph, and I'm going to draw the midline here. So my midline is here at y equals -3. And then if I'm going to do a cosine graph, I basically always look for going from a maximum to a maximum. So meaning if I start here at -pi/4 and then end here at +pi/4, right? That is one complete cosine curve. Okay, one complete cosine curve. Now, drawing those things on there, that's all I need to start finding my important information. All right, so first off, A is amplitude. That is the distance from the midline up to my maximum. So if I go from -3 to -1, that means that A is 2. Okay, B, this is my parent period, which for sine and cosine in radians is 2 pi, divided by the new period. Well, what's my new period? Well, I went from -pi/4 to +pi/4. Okay, so the period of this graph that we're looking at here is pi/2. So we're going to take that period and divide it by our parent. Okay, and if we are dividing, that is actually, right, we're multiplying by the reciprocal. And so we end up with 4. So B is 4. Okay, C, all we have to do is look at the graph and say, where did I say I'm starting horizontally speaking? Okay, well, I said right here that I am starting at -pi/4. So C is -pi/4, and be careful, remember, when we put this in the equation, we're going to have to put in the opposite. And then D, we also get that by looking at our graph. That's simply the midline. That's our vertical shift, and this has gone down 3. So now we can set up our equation. We're going to have y is equal to, oops, forgot my a here. Y is equal to 2 times the cosine of b, which is 4, times, you can use theta or x. Okay, so we've got theta opposite, so it's going to be plus pi/4, and then -3. Okay, so if we're looking back, what do we have to plug in for? We have to plug in for A, B, C, and D. Now, let's go back just real quick and talk about C, the phase shift. I could have started my graph at -3 pi/4, and I could have looked at this cosine curve here. Okay, perfectly acceptable. I could have said, you know what? I actually see one that is upside down. And so I could have said, I see this cosine curve here that goes from -pi/2 to 0. Perfectly fine, okay? We can call this a different equation. We can write it differently based on C, based on where we say the graph is beginning horizontally speaking. Okay, so there are multiple answers that would be correct here. If you had said that you saw this one where it's upside down, kind of, in our minds, right, where it's starting at negative pi over 2, then you would have to make sure that your A is negative 2 instead of positive. All right, let's do one, and let's do a sine one this time. And also, guys, for all of these, we could write a sine or a cosine equation, okay? Always do that for all of them. All right, so on this one, again, I'm going to draw my midline. So my midline here is at positive 1, okay? And then on this one, I am going to do a sine curve. Sine always starts at the midline. So we're going to go this way. Okay, so now if you're looking at this and you're like, well, I'm not really sure what that, starting point is for my x value, guys, think about the fact that everything we do, it's divided up into equal parts. So if we're at 20 degrees here and 40 degrees here, this point is halfway in between them. And therefore, that is going to be, I'm going to put a little mark down here at 30 degrees. Okay. Over here, this is 140 and 160. So this point is ending up at 150 degrees. Okay. So just remember, everything always happens in these nice equal parts. Okay. And if you're ever unsure, did I do it right? I'm going to give you a way to check yourself in just a second. All right. So let's start with A. Remember, A is the distance from the midline to the maximum. So that is going to be 2, just like our last problem. Okay, B, normal, our parent graph period is 360. This one, we are going from 30 to 150. So the period of this graph is 120 degrees. So we're going to divide this by 120 degrees, and that gives us 3. So B is 3. Okay, C, that's our phase shift. We just talked about that. We said this one is starting at 30 degrees. And then D, our vertical shift, that is the midline. So we've got 1. All right, so I'm going to set up my equation. I'm going to have y is equal to 2. This is a sine curve, so 2 times the sine of B is 3. And then I'm going to do x. Remember, we do opposite, so it's going to be minus 30 degrees, representing the fact that we went right from the origin. Close my parentheses, and then we've got plus 1. So there is my equation. Okay. Now, let's say you're a little stressed, you're worried. Did I do B correctly? Do I have the right period? Do I have the right starting and ending point? Well, let's look at this. Okay. Sine and cosine, same thing on here. And let's look at this one just because I can see it clearly. Here is a complete cosine curve. This clearly starts at negative 120 and ends at 0. That's 120 degrees. Okay, so easy check to make sure that my period is correct, because when we're looking at this graph, sine and cosine have all the same characteristics, guys. The only thing that changes between what makes it a sine versus a cosine is C, is where we say the graph starts, what we say the phase shift is. Otherwise, we could write a sine or cosine, and we're correct. All right, let's do one more. Okay, I'm going to find the midline again. So this one goes from negative 4 to 16. That's 12 units. So 6 units in between. That's going to be negative 10 for my midline. Okay, this one, just to show you one that is a reflection, I am actually going to go from here to here, just to show you what this looks like. Oops. Runaway pen. Okay, so I'm looking at this piece right here. Okay, all right, so A is my distance from the midline to the maximum or the midline to the minimum, and that goes from negative 10 to 4, that's 6 units. B, okay, we're in degrees again. Normal is 360 degrees. I'm going to divide by, this went from, if we look at this, we are counting by, looks like 45s, okay? Or you could just simply say, I'm halfway in between negative 180 and 360. So where is that? Well, that is at 270, okay? And then I end over here halfway between 360 and 540. This is negative. Okay, that's 450 degrees. So from negative 270 to 450, that is 720 degrees. So the period for this graph is 720 degrees. Okay, so we're going to divide by 720 and we get 1/2. Okay, C this time, okay, we said we're starting at negative 270. And then D is my midline, which is negative 10. All right, now when I put this all together, here's what we need to be careful with. Number one, this is a reflected cosine curve. Instead of being above the midline and going down first, we're starting below and going up. So this is a negative 6, and then we're going to have cosine of 1/2. And then I'm going to use x this time. Opposite will be plus 270 degrees. And then we've got minus 10. Okay, now let me just show you this while we're here. Let's say I wanted to write a sine function instead. So here's a sine. Remember, sine always starts at the midline. And here goes sine. Okay, everything is the same, guys, except for where this starts. And this is starting at negative 90. So the only thing that's different is the phase shift. It's C. It's negative 90 degrees. It still has an amplitude of 6. The period is still 720 degrees. The midline is still at negative 10. So I can go and write a sine equation and say this one, we're starting at the midline and going up. So it's going to be a positive 6 times the sine of 1/2 times x, do the opposite, so plus 90 degrees, and then minus 10. Okay, so there's where we can write sine and cosine from the same graph.